I'm not an historian, I'm not an international legal scholar. I know a little bit about ethics and rights theory and a little bit about Indigenous studies. But it doesn't take an expert just looking through these documents and noting the dates to see how close Riel was in concept anyway to the content of two of what appear to be, we hope right now, two of the most important documents in Canada right now. And one is the 94 recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the other is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, combined with two recent events. One is the Daniels decision, which of course makes it clear that when we're talking about Indigenous peoples, we're talking about Métis also. And then the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs appearance at the United Nations, along with the Minister of Justice, just last month, to say that the government of Canada is now wholeheartedly committed to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. You may know that there were 4 holdouts to this 2007 passed in the United Nations Declaration who would not sign. The United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Why? Because they have a lot of Indigenous peoples in their country. A lot of the other nations in the world either don't have any anymore or they are themselves the Indigenous people. But the great holdout for the 4 nations I mentioned were, what did it really mean to give rights to Indigenous people? Well, we can see what it meant to Louis Riel to fight for rights for Indigenous people. He lost his life because it was such a threat. And the threat didn't disappear, although history marched on. So the very thought that we're going to commit now to fully support as a nation what it says in the UN Declaration is significant. It helps that it's this year when we're also trying to accomplish the restoration of rights, certainly to one individual and representative of a whole nation, by which I mean the Métis. It's easy to speak in generalities and platitudes about rights. We all say we have them and we support everyone else and we like them. Louis Riel was very specific, and later you might want to look at all of this fine print, or not, to see how close he came, even as far back as 1869, in his concepts and his language to what actually appears in the United Nations Declaration. And by the way, we include the TRC recommendations because 17 of their recommendations say, Canada, fulfill your commitment to the United Nations Declaration. So this is the keystone, and this is sort of a specific way for us really to commit to living into the terms of the UN Declaration. And all of that, I don't think we could say Riel foresaw. Who knows? He was a prophet. But certainly he anticipated. And I just want to give you some interesting, I hope you'll find them, examples. Do not worry, I'm not going to do as the Anglican primate said and have us read in full the United Nations Declaration. But I've got about half a dozen examples from the publications that we know for sure Riel was instrumental in drafting. And they are an 1869 proclamation anticipating what became later another pronouncement of them, more refined, perhaps and detailed, in the Manitoba Act, then in the Revolutionary Bill of Rights from 1885. In the 1869 Declaration, this language appears. Riel is saying, contrary to the laws of nations, in March 1869, the Hudson's Bay Company surrendered and transferred to Canada all the rights which it had, or pretended to have, in this territory, by transactions with which the people were considered unworthy to be made acquainted. The UN Declaration calls this would be calling it a violation of free, prior, and informed consent. The UN Declaration says states shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the indigenous peoples concerned through their own institutions in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. In the Manitoba Act, Riel and his colleagues are saying, there shall be no interference by the Dominion Parliament in the local affairs of this territory, by which he meant Manitoba, other than is allowed in the provinces, and this territory shall have and enjoy in all respects the same privileges, advantages, and aids in meeting the public expenses of this territory as the provinces have and enjoy. The UN Declaration says in Article 2, Indigenous peoples and individuals are free and equal to all other peoples and individuals, and have the right to be free from any kind of discrimination in the exercise of their rights, in particular that based on their indigenous origin or identity. Again, and from the Manitoba Act, treaties should be concluded between the Dominion and the several Indian tribes of the country as soon as possible. The United Nations. Indigenous peoples have the right to the recognition, observance, and enforcement of treaties, agreements, and other arrangements, and to have states honor and respect such treaties, agreements, and other arrangements. Riel says, all the properties, rights, and privileges enjoyed by us should be respected, and local customs, usages, and privileges should be under control of the local legislature. The UN Declaration. Indigenous peoples have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs. And from the Revolutionary Bill of Rights, 1885, in Saskatchewan, these new provincial legislatures, by which he means Saskatchewan, while representation according to population shall be the supreme principle, the Métis shall have a fair and reasonable share of representation. The UN Declaration, Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves. And lastly, also from the Revolutionary Bill of Rights, Riel, all the local customs and usages which obtain among the Métis shall be respected. The UN Declaration, Article 11, Indigenous peoples have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs. The argument is, simply put, and certainly clear to me, and part of our job will, I think, be to use some of this language to buttress the argument based on the commitments that we hear from the government, that if the Canadian government is committed, as it says it is, both to the TRC and now to the UN Declaration, given especially that the Daniels decisions make it crystal clear that Indigenous peoples includes Métis, of whom Riel is a notable member, that it should also commit then to exonerating the Canadian Métis, who in his own way and time laid the groundwork for both of these documents. What a witness he was to the ideas underlying these important and contemporary works. It's not to exonerate him, in my view, leaves a contradiction in place that casts a shadow over what I believe, so far, is the government's sincere commitment to do what it says around these two documents. Exoneration, on the other hand, will only add more brilliance to those sunny ways that we heard about last fall. Thank you.